Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Now, as Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi addressed a number of his supporters in Houston on Sunday. Scores of protesters stood outside the football stadium chanting slogans for Modi to go back. These protesters highlighted the plight of 8 million Kashmiris under lockdown and the millions of minorities within India who state that they are under attack. We take a closer look at this story today. Joining us to discuss it is Mr. Maule, who is a writer and editor at faithwire.com and is a journalist. He's joining us from Belfast, Northern Ireland. We're also joined by Mr. Gurcharan Singh, activist and a member of Dal Khalsa, an organization for Sikh rights from the UK, and Ms. Ruwa Shah, an analyst, joining us from Istanbul. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this show. Mr. Singh, now I'd like to begin with you. While we talk about what was happening in Houston, how many supporters came out to welcome Modi, outside it was mainly the minorities who were protesting. Now, is this reflective of the larger state of India?
I think one of the biggest problems there when we're talking about these kind of events, what we have to realize, these are not organic audience. These are more in like rent-a-crowd, ship-in people, rather than having a more of a organic following. When we talk about Modi, a majority of his outgoings or his media, because this is a big media outgoing for Modi, so these are all staged. The majority of these people who were bought in, were shipped in, were rent-a-crowd, and we have put up evidence on our website and Facebook and everywhere that how they bought in people, they were hired out, they were paid free tickets, day in. There were no tickets available to general public. So these are the things we have to realize when we talk about popularity, and these are mainly staged events for Modi.
Right. But when we're digging deep into that, even if this is staged, there must be supporters of Modi. Now, who do you think makes up these supporters?
Listen, I'm not denying that he has supporters, but the difference is the organic nature of his following, which he's portraying to the global audience, is fundamentally flawed. He's a fascist dictator who wants to implement his theocratical point of view forcefully, not only to India, but Hindutva, his political ideology has a global ambition, which people must see. And this is part of, when we see these events, because this is not the first event he's done. Right. He's done multiple events like this. Especially the dates are being chosen in line with the theology of the Aryan theology. And the programs are held within that process and in holding that the fascist theology of Brahmanism. And the whole thing is orchestrated to a level that it's the entire design. If we talk about this current event he's done, it's called Howdy Modi. The whole the program is the name is complete. But if you look beyond nonsense,
right,
it is a staged event for Hindutva as a political policy. Firstly,
right. Mr. Singh, now stay with me on that point. I want to move to Ms. Shah and talk to you a little about that this was a staged event to show Modi's support. But on that note, now, the optics at this point in time, how important are they for Modi?
I mean, the rally that happened in Houston yesterday is the same for me as the rally that happened in Madison Square in New York in 1939 before Hitler invaded Poland, which was a celebration of fascism and neo-Nazism. You know, Modi is being called out as a fascist dictator right now. And the rally that happened yesterday is the part and is the evidence of the larger propaganda of the RSS and the BJP's politics in India that has happened. And it does not work only. I agree with Mr. Singh that it was not an organic audience in Houston yesterday. But we have to also look into how this rally was organized, because it's a part of the larger scheme of things that is happening in the politics of India, which is the murder of their own democracy, by the way. They have blurred all the lines of secularism. The fabric of Indian secularism has been completely changed. And this is the India right now. This is the new India that Modi and RSS have been working for in the last, I don't know how many decades. And when it comes to Kashmir, there was little, it was a little disappointing because there was not a lot of show of protesters with regard to Kashmir outside that rally. We'd have expected a larger crowd. But it was not there. But anyway, nonetheless, we have 27th September coming up, where Kashmiris are expecting a lot from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, and other Muslim communities as well, who are going to speak in the United Nations Security Council.
Right. Now, Mr. Maule, as we're talking about the Kashmiris and the Muslim minority, you wrote an article about the Christian minority in India, and I'd like you to give us more insight into that in order to understand what is happening in the Indian society right now in terms of all the minorities.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, covering a lot of the Christian persecution, it's very clear that under Modi, this has increased massively. We've seen over 200 incidents of anti-Christian violence this year. It's just an astonishing amount. And it's really fueled by that rhetoric, which is that minorities, religious minorities in particular, don't have a place in India. And obviously, a lot of the attacks are at the hands of Hindu extremists, Hindu radicals, sort of ultra-nationalists who just think that Christians are part of a foreign faith that has no place in India at all. But it's absolutely clear, from listening to people on the ground and different persecution watchdogs and things, that it's getting a lot worse. And that's something which I think is underreported in the press, particularly in the mainstream media, and particularly in the United States. Even it's underreported. So we're trying to sort of bring attention to it. But it's unbelievable. I mean, I've got a whole list of articles, that even just within the last 2 or 3 months, just the most brutal attacks on Christians. So, yeah, and it's just no doubt that this is being fueled by toxic political rhetoric by Modi. It needs to be addressed.
And Mr. Maule, you mentioned here how it's downplayed in most media outlets, not just within India, but internationally as well. Now, keeping in mind Modi's track record, I mean, before he became prime minister, he was barred from entering in the United States because of how of his role in the Gujarat massacres. Now, given all of this, what do you think is still suppressing this information, especially in the international media?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it's very difficult to say because we see it so much. We're reporting on it so often, and it is really an almost daily occurrence. There's something like 27 attacks per month at the moment. So, it's almost one per day. And we're seeing it through a few different partners who are on the ground. But it's really difficult to get it from the Christian media into the mainstream. I think partly it's just the news cycle is crazy. There's lots going on. And a lot of the time it's just not top of the agenda. And that's what we're trying to do. And, we have gained some traction in that. We've seen that once we've actually been listing off what the frequency and the brutality of the attacks, certain media organizations and news stations have picked it up. But it is a struggle. And we've really had to push and push and push to get that into the top news bulletins. Right. But it's hopefully will be addressed in the future, as we keep going with this.
Right. Mr. Singh, going back to you and talking about the Sikh community at large and what their sentiments have been ever since Modi got re-elected, what are their fears? And especially when we're talking about the diaspora at this point in time, when they're seeing what is unfolding within India, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think our community, or if you want to see the wider Punjab, I think political will is clear, and we are trying to make very clear to the world as well through this global referendum in 2020 that our main political agenda is to seek division from the union itself. We don't want to be a part of this union because this union, in reality, the only element which this political union at the moment is benefiting is the fanatic Hindu point of view. And the Hindu fanatics in general, the fascists, have generally used the union as an excuse under which they have, they have used the union to almost justify anything. I'll just like to give you a small example. A Christian pastor in the north of India, south of India, he was tortured all night. His name was Pastor Gideon. We put his story and his posters last month. His tongue was cut out, his teeth were taken out, and his nails were pulled out. And in the media, it was put up that he committed suicide, and nobody questioned. So we have to see this into context, that this is the kind of brutality which minorities are facing in that country, and this is not unique to one community. This is open to all. What's happening in Kashmir is not only limited to Kashmir. This is what we are trying. These are the main reasons why we organize this protest outside the hall. That we are trying to explain to the world that it's not only limited to Kashmir. This fanaticism and fascism and this brutality is not only limited to Kashmir. It's growing out throughout India, and nobody is being spared in this fanatic mindset. Because we have to realize, RSS itself has put out its own membership records that since Modi being elected, they have grown their membership times by 5. So we are talking their membership and their shock troops and the fascist troops outnumber the Indian army by 1 to 5. So we have to really realize that this fanaticism, firstly, is throughout India. Every single state and every single aspect of Indian society is suffering underneath at this moment. Nobody is being spared. Every language at the moment, Amit Shah stood up in the Indian Parliament. India has over 100 languages, and he said we will eradicate every single language and implement Hindi through force. And this is the kind of rhetoric and fanaticism which is going out daily in Indian politics.
Right. Now, Meshal, while we're talking about this, those who are aware of what is happening within India, those minority communities that continuously suffer at the hands of this political rhetoric are, of course, forthcoming. But how does this translate while communicating it to the international community, to the wider audience? Do you think that this is causing further polarization on the issue of Kashmir and India, or do you think people are starting to see what is happening?
No, the Indian people, the masses in India have never been able to see what is happening in Kashmir because they have never been shown the ground realities of Kashmir. And when we talk about Kashmir and the polarization in the mainland India as of now, since the Modi government came into power, I think we are missing out on something here, which is very important, that Kashmir is a political issue and has been a political issue between India and Pakistan for the last 72 years. And it needs a political resolution. Now, seeing it under the ambit of human rights violations that the Indian army has been committing in Kashmir is okay. We talk about it, but we have to go back to the main issue, which is the right to self-determination of the Kashmiri people, which was promised by the Indian Prime Minister itself and the United Nations resolution and everything. There are written evidences that was promised to us. So we need to go, when we talk about Kashmir, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the promise that was given to us and has not been kept. Now, when it comes to polarization, of course, Indian people do not realize and do not see Kashmir as an issue because they have always been fed and, according to a proper propaganda that Kashmir is an integral part of India and Kashmiris don't want to be with India. Because I have lived in India and I have worked in the newsrooms of Indian newspapers, and I know how the language is changed. It is inculcated very subtly into the languages every day that the people of India read. So expecting people to understand that at this moment immediately is not possible. But yes, when we talk about Kashmir today, it's not only about abrogation of Article 370, it is about the long-standing issue, which is the right to self-determination of the people of Kashmir.
Right. And Mr. Mole, following from Ms. Shah was talking about here that Kashmir requires a political solution because it is a political matter. Now, with the right-wing governments rising, their political rhetoric becoming more aggressive with everything that's happening, and this isn't just in India, but it is a global phenomena that we are witnessing. What do you think is going to unfold in the coming days, especially on the 27th?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I think the protests are going to be enormous for good reason. I think there's a sense by which that what Modi is doing isn't being addressed fully by a lot of politicians at the top level, and it needs to be. You know, from my background and what we've been covering with the persecution, it's astonishing to me that more Congress people aren't talking about this. More U.S. congressmen who are supposedly very much about religious freedom. And they talk about it a lot, and they send special envoys around the world to try and, take American values of religious freedom to other places. There's a huge welcoming of Modi, and you see what he's doing in India and what is spiraling and transpiring there. It's astonishing. So I think there needs to be a real urgency from governments to actually stand up and say, look, this is a serious issue. I mean, we've even seen out of 218 incidents so far this year, there's only been 25 police reports filed of all those incidents. Well, that clearly shows that there's a complete and utter breakdown of the justice system and the policing process, and there's a distrust in the police in India and in these communities, and that needs to be addressed as well. There's so many justice issues which Congress people and these governments need to actually start standing up for the minorities and actually start to say, no, we need to change this and we need to campaign, and that requires bold action. Requires bold action from congressmen in the US who actually need to confront Modi about it and actually put it to him and say, what about this issue and what about this? And we've seen President Trump has done that on a few occasions. He did it, I believe it was last year with the Nigerian president. You know, he was really tough with him about the treatment of minorities in Nigeria and the terror threat. But it needs to be done on several occasions. It needs to be called out every time.
And I want to ask Mr. Singh that now, should we expect to step up to the plate, and especially from these Western democracies that talk about plurality, that talk about secularism, that talk about religious freedom, but in this case don't seem to be giving out a strong reaction enough? Now, in all of this, who do you think should be stepping up and doing this, and who can the larger community, especially the Kashmiri community, the Sikh community, the minorities, expect from at this point?
I think what we have to is that we have to realize that we have to become a political force ourselves, and we can bring the change, not expect change from others, but bring the change ourselves. Because one of the biggest problems when we talk about international media not picking this up, and not engaging with the issue, what we have to realize is the Hindutva lobby is a global lobby. It has its tentacles. Well, Silicon Valley is more or less completely penetrated. And we talk about Western media. Majority of Western media has been penetrated by fanatics of the RSS all over the place. So this, whenever anything about India comes in, all of these, sleeping cells and these fanatics within the global media are being activated and told to suppress it. We saw this when Modi came here in UK and we arranged a protest. Every single media outlet was directly, financially paid by the Indians to make sure none of the protesters got onto the British press. And this is what we have to realize.
Right.
There is a true form of conflict which the Hindu fanatics are fighting. One is the information conflict, which they're trying to completely suppress any form of negative information or any form of information at all. And second is the physical conflict, which they're waging war in India on every single one who opposes them. And these two must be. And the only person who's going to have to fight this is ourselves. We cannot rely on others because our activists at the moment are...
Mr. Singh, now that's an essential point you make there, and that's a comment I also want Shah to reflect upon. Now, as Mr. Singh said that it's us who we need to empower, but he also mentioned here that the Indian state is systematically trying to suppress information from coming out. And in Kashmir, this is more explicit than ever before. As the lockdown enters its 50th day, those people don't have a voice. What do you think is the momentum amongst the Kashmiri diaspora living in different countries, and what options do they have?
Of course, it's the 51st day of the communication blockade that is I think, the longest ever we have ever had. And Kashmiris are not being able to speak. Kashmiri voices are not being heard by the international community. So what we need right now is the active diaspora in almost all the Western democracies, as you mentioned. And Kashmiris themselves, I agree with Mr. Singh that we need to be the change, right? We can't expect others. So I think the responsibility comes to us directly. This generation of Kashmir needs to come out, create a stronger diaspora, and be able to have an influence on those who are in the position of powers, so that our voices are reached where they can be, and actually make an effect. So I think diaspora first, everywhere they have to contact every embassies. Wherever there are Kashmiris around the world, Pakistanis or whoever is in support of Kashmir issue, should go to all those diplomats and talk to them, speak in whatever way possible. That is what we are doing. I mean, I'm a student, but I'm trying my best to speak for Kashmir in whatever way possible. And so are other Kashmiris around the world, organizing protests and everything. I think that is what we have in our hands. And first, we need to come out of Kashmir, because India is doing every possible thing to suppress every sort of voice that anybody raises in favor of Kashmir.
Right. At that point, thank you so much, Ms. Ruwa Shah, for joining us from Istanbul. Thank you, Mr. Maule, for joining us, and Mr. Gurcharan Singh for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we discuss the growing dissent in Egypt. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, as what was seen as completely unexpected, over the weekend, protesters in Egypt took the streets to demand the resignation of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi after contractor and actor Mohamad Ali alleged that Sisi had been involved in widespread corruption. The question to be asked is, what do these protests mean for the Egyptian people? We take a closer look at the story. Joining us for this discussion is Ms. Dalia, Fahmy, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Policy and a Professor of Political Science at the Long Island University, joining us from Washington, D.C. We're also joined by Mr. Mohamad Elmasry, who's the Chair and Associate Professor of Journalism and Media at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, joining us from Doha. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Dalia, now let me begin with you. These protests, this dissent was seen as a complete shock. Why do you think that is? And how important do you think that is at this point in time?
The reason why the protests are seen as shocking is because of the unprecedented repression of the Sisi regime. In the past couple of years, really the last 3 years, have been marked by extreme repression in terms of mass arrests, disappearances, extrajudicial killings. In the 2011 time period during the revolution, what became known as Generation Protest, today is known as Generation Jail, because the upwards of 60,000 political prisoners. And so for people to come to the street, whether it's hundreds or thousands, but just even a few, means that they're taking a huge personal risk on themselves. The fact that 273 people have already been arrested with whereabouts or conditions unknown is also telling. So on one hand, it is surprising that people would risk their lives to that extent to protest. On the other hand, it's not surprising because of the social, political, and economic repression that Egypt has endured in the past couple of years. If you look at it at the economic level, the average age in Egypt today is 25 years old. 25 years old for a population of over 100 million is a pretty dire situation in terms of economic and also needs for jobs. Now, when the situation is such that the population is so young and the internal debt of Egypt has tripled and the external loans have tripled and GDP growth, while 5%, doesn't really trickle down to the average Egyptian. On the other hand, rather, the average Egyptian's income has declined, and with extreme austerity measures and a rise in price of basic goods, you can tell that the society has been choked to a certain extent. Add to that the fact that there is no free press, there is no freedom of expression. The calls for democracy, good governance, and transparency that were called for 2011 have not just completely disappeared, there is no such avenues. And in terms of politics, the fact that no independent political parties can be formed, no voices of dissent can happen in the political atmosphere, and that parliament and the judiciary have become rubber stamps to the regime itself, basically creating an extreme executive, lends itself to a population that today has been socially, politically, and economically squeezed. So while it's surprising that people would risk their lives, it's unsurprising because of the sheer conditions they live under.
Right. And as you're saying, it is the sheer frustration, the conditions that caused for them to take this personal risk, go out on the streets and protest. But the larger question is, what will these protests lead to? What are your thoughts on that?
It is honestly too early to tell. I think we have another critical moment coming upon us on Friday where the calls for people to return to the streets have been made. And so if people do indeed return to the street on Friday, and whether they're larger or smaller, I think we have to wait and see how the regime responds. So it's too early to tell what this will lead to or what this moment is. But I think it's a very important moment because to a certain extent, the fear barrier has been broken. And we should wait and see what happens this Friday and how, more importantly, the government responds.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Dalia Fahmy, for joining us and talking to us. Now, Mr. Elmasry, while we're talking about this, that it's too early to tell what this will lead to, there is this growing frustration and this cause to break the barrier that CC has imposed, the repression that the government has imposed upon the people. Give us a sense of that. How has it been during the CC years?
Well, part of your question cut out, but I think I got most of it. The Sisi government is the most brutal and repressive in Egypt's modern history. And that's really saying something when you consider the fact that Egypt has endured about 70 years of military dictatorship. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat, and Hosni Mubarak were all highly authoritarian. But in terms of just the sheer quantity of repressive measures that have been implemented and carried out, the Sisi government is really the worst of the bunch. Dalia already spoke to the arrests, the mass killings in the streets, the shutdown of all opposition media. Essentially, Egypt is a closed society. It's one-man rule. There is no room for competition. The very first thing that Sisi did when he took over in a military coup in 2013 is move to eliminate all forms of opposition. So he banned all of the serious opposition parties and all of the serious oppositional media. The second thing that he did after that is move to completely eliminate all forms of dissent. So we're talking about a government that monitors even social media, right? Egyptians have been arrested for things that they've written on their private Facebook pages. There's a really long laundry list of repressive measures that have been taken. So, as I said, and as Dr. Fahmy already indicated, it's a very brutal authoritarian government, and that's one of the reasons why people are surprised that Egyptians are being brave and risking their lives by going out into the streets. Right.
On that point, I'd like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. George Szamuely, who's a Middle East expert joining us from Budapest. Now, welcome to the show, George. While we're talking about the repression and the measures that were taken to silence dissent before this, and the fact that with these protests, it's a historic moment because that barrier has almost been brought down. Do you think the government, the military establishment would now be forced to engage with the people of Egypt?
I have my doubts. They have the experience of what happened in 2011 to refer to, and I don't think they want to go down that path again. I mean, they don't want to go back to the overthrow of Mubarak, and then an opposition coming to power like Morsi, military coup, and so on. So I would be surprised if the Sisi government will respond in any particularly conciliatory way, particularly as I don't think that there'll be a lot of sympathy for the opposition, particularly in the United States, which again has the experience of what happened in 2011 to go by. or from anyone else. I think, again, the Europeans do not want chaos in Egypt. They don't want a flood of refugees pouring into Egypt. So I tend to think that Sisi will respond to the protests much more harshly than Mubarak did.
Right. Now, Mr. Elmasry, on that point, the data that is coming out of those arrests that have been made show that most of the protesters do belong to the younger demographic. And as we discussed earlier, this is the main demographic that will be impacted by economic policies in the future as well. Now, Sisi's government cannot expect that this reaction will not come about again if the conditions worsen. Do you think that the government might move towards some form of economic reform?
The Egyptian government is highly corrupt. I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but authoritarianism, military dictatorship, these kinds of governments breed corruption. So in many ways, these videos that have been released over the past 2.5 weeks by Mohamad Ali, this former military contractor, they're not surprising in the least. Really, there's nothing groundbreaking there. Egyptians know that their government is corrupt. The Sisi government says that it's implementing economic reforms, but all of its economic measures are really seen as helping the so-called top 1% of the Egyptian society. He expanded the Suez Canal. He is building a new administrative capital. The wealth gap continues to increase. Poverty is rising. Even according to the Egyptian government's own statistical data, about 1/3 of Egyptians live in acute poverty on just about $1.50 a day. If we use more realistic poverty markers like those from the World Bank, then we get something like 60% of Egyptians living in poverty. And as Dr. Fahmy said at the beginning of the program, many Egyptians are very young. So Sisi has a real problem on his hands. If not right now, in the immediate future, then certainly in the coming months and years.
Right. And Mr. George, what do you see to that as well? What do you predict happening in the coming future? We're talking about not just the coming months, but even next Friday, when there are calls for people to come out on the streets, protest against the government, against its corruption.
I think that the Sisi government will respond with considerable force. I think that they will go out of their way to make sure that nothing like 2011 will happen again, because, well, obviously the military, it doesn't want to have anything to do with anything that might lead to, again, a resurgence of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think that he pretty much has a blank check, because the Trump administration is pursuing a very traditionalist policy in the Middle East, which is Egypt, Israel, unconditional support for all three. This is very different from the Obama administration. So therefore, anything that Sisi does in terms of the use of force to put down the opposition will be met with, at best indifference and at worst actually support from the Trump administration. So I think that Sisi will respond with considerable force.
Right. And Mr. Elmasry, while we're talking about the responding with considerable force and the fact that there are many human rights groups that claim Egypt as an open-air prison. Now, with this, and as George talked about, that the U.S. is going to give unconditional support to Egypt, what can the Egyptian people expect from the international community?
Well, first of all, I'd say that I concur that if the protests are sustained, and especially if they are large, we have no reason to think that the Sisi government would show any mercy. This would be a battle for survival. It would be an existential battle for the Sisi government. And this is a government that has already killed many hundreds of unarmed protesters. They killed more than 900 unarmed protesters on a single day in August of 2013 at the Rabaa and Nahda square massacres, right? Now, in terms of the international community, the international community has largely turned a blind eye to Sisi's atrocities, in part because I think he does their bidding in the Middle East, and he's seen as somebody who can bring about stability. I happen to think that's a misguided approach. Sisi's government has witnessed really, or I should say, has brought about unprecedented instability in Egypt. There have been more violent attacks, both by vigilante groups and by the government in the past 6 years than at any other time in Egypt's modern history. But at the end of the day, what's going to dictate the terms of the present situation is the street, the Egyptian street. If protests are small, and particularly if they die out, then we know what's going to happen. Sisi will crack down even further to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And then it very well may be the end of it. But if the protests are large and if they are sustained, as I said earlier, then the Sisi government is going to have a problem on its hands. It is very difficult to control these massive protests. We've seen it time and time again in Egypt. The Mubarak government unleashed all of its brute force on protesters in 2011, and it was unable to subdue them. And in fact, the protesters seemed to get angrier and more passionate as the government moved to eliminate them and kill them en masse. So we have to wait until Friday to see what happens next.
Right. Last question to you, George. Now, while seeing all of this, and we talk about the crackdown on dissent and media coverage being halted in Egypt, what role do you think the international media, independent journalists need to play at this point in time? Arab Spring was seen as a social media revolution in this case as well. How important of a role will that play in the mobilization of protesters?
Well, it may certainly play a role, but ultimately I don't think it will be decisive. I think what will be decisive is the attitude of the Trump administration towards Sisi, and I think the attitude towards the European Union towards Sisi, because they have the experience of 2011 to go by, and they don't want to go down that path again. They don't want another uprising followed by a coup, followed by mass killings, and they will go for stability, and they will associate stability with Sisi. And so even if the repression will be quite nasty, I think that the Trump administration certainly will say that, well, we need this for stability, and therefore I don't think the social media will play the role that it played in 2011 when Obama was very ambivalent about what was going on during the Arab Spring. I mean, yes, on the one hand, Mubarak was an ally, but they didn't really want repression. This is not the case anymore. Trump is not ambivalent in any way. He's going to support Sisi all down the line.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. George Szamuely, for joining us from Budapest, and thank you, Mr. Mohamad Elmasry, for talking to us from Doha. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye.